Coming up on ParaTruth Reborn, we're talking about the myth and history behind St. Patrick.
Welcome to ParaTruth.
What's up, everybody, and welcome to ParaTruth Reborn. St. Patty's Day special in particular. We're doing it a little early here, 1 week early because we do have a guest next week. But we are live on 107.7 FM New Orleans and 105.3 FM on the Gulf Coast and United Public Radio Network. My name is Eric.
And I'm Justin.
And many of us celebrate St. Patrick's Day around the world by going out to bars to have green beer and have corned beef and cabbage and all the wonderful fixins that come with celebrating St. Patty's Day. Whether you're into the big parties or if you're like Justin and I, you're just kind of chilling at home with your beer, to each their own. But nonetheless, this has always been one of our favorite times of year, and I think in part because it kind of ushers in spring, which means warm weather's around the corner and all the green is coming back.
Well, and, I don't know about everywhere, but in Ohio and in North Dakota, the weather's been super weird, teasing us a little bit, and then it's hit with snow, tease a little bit and hit with snow. So this will be absolutely amazing if we're really that close to spring. But there's so much more to St. Patrick's and St. Patrick's Day. Lore and myth and even history. So it's a lot more than what we're celebrating it for.
Yeah, 100%. But I think to really kick off this episode, it's probably best to really get into who exactly the real St. Patrick is, because there is a lot of myth surrounding his story. And in fact, there are some people, believe it or not, who claim he never even existed in the first place, that he's just a fictional character, which is kind of wild considering that there is historical documentation. So, with that said, most people think St. Patrick himself was actually Irish. But is that true? Justin?
Well, to go back to the whole saints thing real quick, I mean, there's the part of that is like there's so many saints like St. Valentine, where there's a couple of different, or even St. Nicholas, where there's a couple of different guys that could have been it. But this was the only St. Patrick, of course. And there, like Eric said, there's documentation. He was not Irish, believe it or not. He was Roman British, born around late 4th century. As a teenager, he was kidnapped by Irish raiders and enslaved in Ireland for about 6 years, which is just mind-blowing to me. And if you look at how kidnappings happen today, they even go for much longer sometimes. So that was amazing that he was able to escape that. But during his captivity, he claimed to experience intense religious visions. After escaping, he later returned to Ireland, not as a slave, but as a missionary from the church.
Which is, something that we kind of see over and over again within the Christian church, is these people who become enslaved and then, find their way to freedom and for some reason find a calling to go back to their original captors to preach the gospel itself. Now, there is some story that claim that Patrick had visions along with his teachings and his ministry. Is that true?
According to his writings, the Confessio, yes. Patrick describes hearing the voice of God in dreams, experiencing guidance through visions. He believed divine messages instructed him to return to Ireland, which, I mean, again, with a lot of the different saints, and even in the Bible, God leads people to these different areas. But, as saints or as missionaries, it was to bring the word to the uh, pagans, basically.
Mhm. And that kind of puts him, the fact that he had these dreams and these callings and hear God's voice and would have these divine messages kind of puts him in this genre of mysticism as well, very similar to Mother Teresa, who also was considered a mysticist, which, when you dive into the definition, I think a lot of people think, well, that doesn't make sense to be a mysticist, but, this Christian person, or who claims to be a Christian person, because they don't always go hand in hand in modern descriptions of the two. A lot of people think mysticism tends to be more New Agey, which it isn't actually. It's actually an ancient thing that accompanied a lot of God's people on as well. Um, but now, one of the big stories when it comes to St. Patrick was the story of how he drove all the snakes from Ireland. Did St. Patrick literally banish snakes from Ireland, or is there a little more to the story, or something we're missing?
Uh, Absolutely not. He it's this drives me nuts because it's one of those things that you hear this legend, but Ireland never had native snakes after that the first or the last ice age. Snakes that are widely interpreted as symbolic from this story. Most scholars believe they represented pagan religion or druidic practices, even. So when the legend says he drove out the snakes, it's not literal. It is meant to be a symbolism of displacing Celtic paganism, basically.
Mhm. I mean, and so calling, in this case, Celtic pagan snakes is really just bashing.
Well,
Is
yeah,
what he's
it's not.
doing. You know,
And I mean, the church was kind of known for that back in the day, at
for
least for
sure.
the legends and the symbolism behind these things.
Yeah, we've heard Christ or have read Christ talk about snakes quite a few times throughout the New Testament, and he even talks to the Pharisees, calling them a brood of vipers on multiple
Mhm.
occasions. And these are people who, some could say, oh, bottom dwellers, if you will, or they slither on the ground and they eat dust on the, because they're slithering on the belly, or they strike with fangs. They're quick to just you know, stick their venom into somebody and let them rot from the inside out.
Well, it kind of goes back to the Bible, though, to the snake in the garden
Mhm.
and how it was somebody who, not necessarily Lucifer, it could have been just somebody leading the Adam and Eve away from God. So it could symbolize that as well,
Mhm.
them being satanic in a sense.
I mean, yeah, it could be satanic. Could be. I mean, it could be so many different things, And I know there's been a lot of conversation, even in the Christian, not within. I'm sorry, within the Christian church, but also in particular within Christian education. I got a associate's degree in religion, and one of the
Right.
things that we talked about was who exactly the serpent was, because there's a number of different beliefs. Obviously, the most recognized belief is that it was indeed Satan, the angel of heaven, Lucifer, as he is mentioned in the book of Isaiah. But also, there is some suggestion that this was another angel or demonic like creature or entity uh, form, just a straight up snake that had no spiritual connection whatsoever. There is historical evidence, archaeological records that prove that snakes did at one point have limbs and walked on feet. And so there's this story in the Old Testament, right in the beginning of Genesis, when after the serpent tricks Adam and Eve into eating the fruit from the tree, uh, God basically curses him to slither on his belly, takes away
Mm.
his wings. And there's a lot of controversy around that until we found this archaeological uh, evidence, which is pretty crazy to think about. And that
Yeah.
makes on feet.
Right. Well, and I mean, so it basically was kind of like a lizard, like a I can't even think of there's some really long lizards, but Yeah, basically a lizard, and it got cursed to not have those legs anymore.
Yeah. Well, and then on top of that, there's obviously a lot of discussion as to if this was just a regular snake, a regular serpent who was crafty. He apparently spoke. And so there was this
Right.
belief that animals at one point did speak in the early days before the fall. Now,
Or
whether or
maybe
not
Adam and Eve just understood it just because they were
that is very
a
possible.
direct, not descendant, but created straight from the Lord's breath. So,
Mhm. Well, now, when it comes to the Druids and Patrick driving them out, was there any real conflict with that, or did they go with peace?
yes, but not as bad as certain religion conflicts go. Early accounts of confrontation between Patrick and the Druids, of course. Some stories depict dramatic spiritual showdowns, curses, fire rituals, even contests of power, almost like a wizard battle, I guess you could say. Not exactly, but that's what kind of visualization comes to me. But these stories read like less like peaceful conversation and more like a supernatural confrontation or a battle.
Mhm. Which again, we see a lot through scripture, so it would make sense that there would be this kind of belief behind it. Like it's interesting that that when it comes to St. Patrick, there literally is a legend. Um,
Mhm.
it's like story upon story that formed itself into something that is just so out there, and very movie like.
Yep.
When in reality, it doesn't work that way. But I don't know. Different times, maybe I don't know. You have to be there.
Well, and that's the interesting thing is like more like a supernatural confrontation, but a lot of the stories that you hear about stuff like this where just generically saying this, a magical confrontation, um a lot of that stuff was dramatized, so this could absolutely have been the same thing.
Hmm. Well, and then on top of that, it's like I like to think of it this way: we don't really know what happens in the spiritual world, right,
True.
at any given time. And so when somebody's using prayer or someone else is casting spells or whatever, like right on the surface, it's like, oh, we just see people throwing hands back and forth, and it's like nothing's happening. But then if you were to go into the spiritual realm, maybe there's this whole light show happening for all we know.
Right.
And it is kind of what we see in the movies. At that case, you need like Harry Potter, right? You got Voldemort and Harry Potter just blasting each other with bolts of electricity or magic or
Yeah.
whatever it is they
And
use.
sometimes just force of magical force that you can't even see. So
Mhm. Well, now another big element to the St. Patrick story, of course, and to St. Patty's Day is the shamrock and the symbolism behind the shamrock. Uh, so, how does the shamrock play into the story of St. Patrick? And did he actually invent the shamrock as a symbol for the Holy Trinity?
so there is no historical proof of this.
Mhm.
But the legend says he used the three-leaf clover to explain Christianity, or I'm sorry, the Christian Trinity, Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Interestingly, the number three was already a sacred uh, number in Celtic spirituality. Triple goddesses, triple spirals, triads. So was Patrick adapting Christian theology to fit Celtic belief systems, or strategically blending traditions? No real history there is to say for sure, but it has happened in multiple cultures where Christianity blends a lot of the other beliefs to help bring pagans to Christianity. So,
Right, and we do have some historical evidence that does support Saint Patrick combining the Christian cross with the sun god of the Druids of Ireland, and that's where you get the Celtic cross from. The
that's the
Christian or the
circle, right?
cross with the circle in the center of it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So he did. There is evidence that he has used some of their original belief system and kind of meshed it with the Christian belief system to make adaptation easier for them. to come to the Lord. And like you said, we do see that throughout history a lot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, now when it comes to that, when it comes to converge, what's the word?
Conversion.
Yeah, but I was thinking of converting.
Oh yeah,
Where
converting.
I'm thinking,
Yeah.
I'm like converging. That's not right. Converting.
Eric's a little under the weather, so forgive him.
When it comes when it comes to converting Ireland, was it a peaceful conversion? Like, how did uh, and how did Patrick force conversion overall?
Well, that's the interesting thing about this is compared to other areas of Europe, Ireland's conversion was relatively nonviolent. I mean, we've talked about how he had supernatural confrontations with the druids, but there's little archaeological evidence of widespread destruction of pagan sites in Ireland, which is why we probably still have like the I lost what it is the Stonehenge,
Oh,
um, and there's plenty of other sites that were never destroyed. So instead of many sacred sites were actually repurposed. In other words, churches being put on them or vice, what have you.
mhm,
Um, Now, this suggests something fascinating. Christianity in Ireland may have merged with existing Celtic spirituality instead of completely erasing it altogether, which happened in other areas. Now, that blending is why Irish Christianity developed its own mystical flavor, as you mentioned, the Celtic cross.
mhm.
I do believe there's some magic involved with Irish Christianity, or at least um, not necessarily spells, but something along those lines.
Mhm. Well, now, when we talk about then, like the idea of magical flavor, we got to start thinking a bit about the supernatural. And in this case, in particular, the supernatural claims behind St. Patrick's story. Are there miracles, first and foremost, that had happened within Ireland during this time? And were those miracles directly attributed to Patrick himself?
Yeah, there were a lot of them. Legends claim that he himself raised people from the dead, turned enemies to stone, lit a sacred fire that defied a pagan king. Now you do hear this from other saints or religious figures, but not as many um, as that were in the Bible. So
Mm,
now historically verifiable, no, of course not, because it could have been fabricated, and he just made up these stories to tell the Irish pagans so that it made him look more powerful. But culturally powerful, absolutely. It made Patrick become less of a historical figure and kind of more of an archetype, which is probably why a lot of people believe that he might not have existed at all.
mhm. And I would argue, like, I'm sure if any of these are stories, that he didn't go out of his way to fabricate them himself, but instead were fabricated by the druids who maybe witnessed something and either they didn't see it the way they thought they saw it, or I should say, they saw it the way it didn't really happen. Um, because that's really how legends are born, right? Like it's kind of like telephone. You tell a story, and that story gets bigger and bigger when it comes to a legend until it's a complete blatant lie. But like you said, there is no real historical factor on what exactly happened and what he was capable of doing. But we do know that there is some historical evidence about certain things throughout Scripture that are defined as quote unquote miracles.
Hmm.
So that alone kind of I find intriguing, knowing that it is possible. And we know that the saints, based on historical evidence, and I don't say historical evidence as in, oh, according to the Christian church, but these are historical documentations by the Romans that are written in ancient books that basically cross with the Christian texts as being variable, being true. Jesus turning water into wine, raising the dead, things like that. That you know, typically, if it wasn't true, Romans wouldn't go out of the way to write it down, but
Right.
they did. Um, I will say that it would be really nice to have the power to turn enemies to stone. That would be amazing.
I mean, any powers would be fantastic in my mind. I mean, I don't know how many times I've fantasized about having a superpower. So
Yeah. Oh, for sure. So now, was Patrick a saint, a strategist, or a spiritual warrior?
probably all three. He was as we mentioned, former slave, a visionary mystic, a religious reformer. He brought a lot of reform to the church as well as to converting pagans, and a political operator. In other words, kind of sort of a politician in a sense back in those days.
Mhm.
Um, and whether you see him as divinely inspired or mythologized, wow, hero, he reshaped an entire culture in Ireland.
Mhm. Which we see time and time again throughout history, and not just ancient history, even in modern history, we see this. Um, in terms of becoming like a mythical person, in a sense, which is really kind of wild because it goes to show that if you have enough people who support you and raise you up, they can create the status for you uh, that, quite frankly, you don't deserve. Okay, because how many of us are mythical, right? Uh,
Right.
but nonetheless, uh, when you look at the text that we do have about Saint Patrick, um, we do know, or at least we have an idea that he must have been divinely inspired based on the success that he had in converting Ireland into the Christian faith. Because that doesn't come easy in most
Mhm.
cases.
Right.
People aren't typically just pushovers. Everyone wants to fight back uh, with their own beliefs and their own views. And so when you see somebody convert, there's a reason behind it. It's not because, in most cases, it's not because they're forced to do it, but it's because they see something or they hear something or they learn something that's like straight speaks to their core values and their core being. Is like, this seems right, you know.
Right. And with the history that is out there, I don't know if it shows that. I mean, he obviously went with a ship, but I don't know if he went with other missionaries or took it upon himself to go and reach out to these tribes himself without any escort.
Okay.
But that would have been really dangerous. So if he did it that way, St. Patrick was a very brave guy
For
because
sure.
Ireland back then was very much a not savage, but it was very much a chaotic and uh I talked about, Irish raiders coming to kidnap him when he was younger too. So it
Mhm.
was very much um chaotic. I guess is the correct term there. It was not as civilized as it is today.
Right. Well, I mean, we've learned a lot here about Saint Patrick, and you've really delved into his history based on what we know, whether it's through historical context or through um, what are potentially just stories, fairy tales. But nonetheless, we get this idea, this kind of rounded idea of who he was, both the myth, the man, and the legend, right? Because he's a bit of all three. Um, and obviously, historically speaking, it's true that he had one of the biggest impacts, both for the Christian faith, but also for a country in
Mhm.
general, to convert virtually an entire country roughly by himself is pretty big deed, especially for the time
Right.
then.
Yeah.
But now that we've covered a lot here on St. Patrick, let's shift gears a little bit because there is this other character really involved in St. Patty's Day. And this is one of those characters that I think everybody kind of, I think, well, I'm sure everybody knows, and to some extent loves, maybe in some cases absolutely despises, depending on how you were raised and the movies you watched. But that is the story of the leprechaun, and in particularly the mystery behind the leprechaun. Now, of course, I grew up on the leprechaun horror films, so naturally, I don't always like leprechauns. They're creepy critters when you look into the movies, but there's more behind it. It goes much deeper and it's much more ancient, and it does have an origin, right? So, where did the idea of the leprechaun come from?
Well, leprechauns were in old Irish folklore long before St. Patrick came around. They're believed to be a type of fae or fairy spirit, specifically a solitary trickster who worked as a shoemaker for the fairy world. The word leprechaun likely comes from the Irish uh, luchapon, I think is which roughly translates to small-bodied spirit. In traditional stories, weren't they weren't cute or friendly. They were mischievous, secretive, and sometimes dangerous. Hence, where the horror movie came from, it really honed in on that because uh, from when we were younger, at least, the leprechaun was as a fun, friendly guy who was just trying to get back his Lucky Charms from the kids.
Right. You see, and that's how it all starts. You try to turn something like this into a kid's uh, avatar, and then next thing you know, you got kids wet in the bed and being attacked by something that they didn't think was real.
Those darn Disney movies, man.
Disney movies. Well, now here's a straight up question: were leprechauns considered supernatural beings?
Oh yeah, I mean, it says it right there in the description of the folklore. They were of the fae or fairy. In Celtic folklore, leprechauns were part of the IOC, the supernatural fairy race believed in inhabiting Ireland's hills, forests, and ancient sites. People believed these beings were guarding hidden treasure, played tricks on humans, lived in another realm parallel to ours.
Mhm.
Excuse me, kind of like the jinn from uh, Islam.
Mhm.
Uh, they are very much a spiritual or supernatural being. So in many ways, they functioned like interdimensional tricksters in folklore.
Mhm. So, well, and that makes a lot of sense. Obviously that it would potentially be a supernatural being and even spiritual. Um, but let's jump into modern times because we have a lot of these beings that we believe to be spiritual um, through ancient texts and ancient belief systems. But now people are starting to say, oh, interdimensional. Are we talking about extraterrestrials? Uh, something beyond this world. And in this case, we're talking about something that potentially would come from outer space rather than an interdimensional being that exists here on this earth. Like, is that a possibility? Or do you think that's more of a stretch? That's just people who are now like, hey, you're an extraterrestrial, you're an extraterrestrial, you're an extraterrestrial, we're all extraterrestrials, right?
Well, I think that's the problem the paranormal is falling into is that we're trying to slam all of these beings into one bubble.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
A lot of people are now saying that aliens are not from another planet, but interdimensional aliens, if you will, coming in through another reality. Um, I don't believe that all extraterrestrials are that way. Same thing with a lot of these cryptids. They're all being slammed into, well, they must be interdimensional. We haven't seen a physical body or found a dead body. Um, and that's where I think you and I both probably start to get a little annoyed with the paranormal is that um, we want to try and put a definition on things. And, back then when all this folklore came about, and I'm not saying these things aren't real because I do believe a lot of them are, but we always wanted to come up with a reason for something happening back then.
Mm.
Whether these creatures are real or not, we were trying to place something outside of ourselves on, for example, speaking of the leprechaun, things going missing,
Right.
stuff like that, and we can't find them. Again, I do believe that spiritual beings can make that happen. They'll take your things and put them somewhere else, and then years later you find them.
Right.
But as a culture or as a society, humans try to place blame on non-physical beings.
Why did this airplane crash? Why did that car stop working? Oh, it's gremlins, right? That was
Right.
one of the big things at one point.
Or they call it an act of God, and that's not necessarily the case at all.
Right. Do you think, like, I know we've covered this so many times, but do you think that people are trying to keep everything in a single bubble because it's just easier to manage that way? Because obviously within the paranormal world, within the supernatural world, there are so many branches that we can talk about, right? Because we have various types of spirits, various types of entities, and very going for everything from God Himself and various angelic beings, demonic beings, sub-demonic, sub-spirits, think, et cetera, et cetera. There's like this huge kind of pyramid of entities. And instead of trying to classify each and every one, it's like, oh, well, let's just make them one big bubble and boom, they're all the same.
I think we're trying to simplify it, yeah. And like I mentioned about ancient humans trying to put blame on something, it's because they were trying to simplify something too. So yes, in a sense, we're trying to simplify it, and really, I feel there's a way more complex answer than we realize.
Yeah. I think my favorite part about all this is like we sit here every week with all this speculation, and a lot of us do here on UPRN when it comes to the paranormal. And it's fascinating because, like, I think many times we don't think about this, but as we're talking about these things and we're having these kind of like back and forth, uh, I come to this sudden realization that there is potentially somewhere in an alternate reality these entities sitting at a computer of their own type doing the exact same thing about humans, whether or not we even exist, whether we're interdimensional, whether we're physical beings, and it's like, I think a lot of us want to think everything that's outside of this physical realm is higher than us. They're smarter, they're wiser, they're stronger. We don't have any proof of that. It's very possible that we are one of the strongest beings. We just don't see it that way because we are limited based on our dimension that we know. Whereas there are other dimensions where maybe various entities are much more limited than what even we are. And they're speculating and they're thinking, oh, well, we're higher. And of course, that's just something that like popped in my mind. Like, there is that possibility. We're always going around the board trying to figure out what these things are, but it's very possible they're trying to do the same thing.
Right. Well, and I mean, and it's all been jokes, of course, but how many people have made this little parody thing of aliens, and they're like, "Oh, did you see the new episode of Earth?
Yeah.
It's crazy, man." So, but the one thing that a lot of our guests have even said to us is that humans, unlike a lot of these other entities, are co-creators of our reality.
Mm.
Now, is that true in other realities? Like you already mentioned, it'd be interesting to find out because maybe there aren't humans in some realities.
Right. Well, yeah, in a second we talk about, we have talked about, oh goodness, can't think of the word, but when as an individual or as like a mass group, we can create an entity based on,
Tulpa.
yes, Topo. Um, it's possible then that many of these creatures or entities that do exist, or at least some of them, exist simply because we did create them. And since we're here talking about St. Patrick and him being a Christian man, of course, um, you know, if then we were, and regardless of what you believe, whether you're Christian faith or you just believe in a higher power, we all have that God spark, and the God spark means that we are creators. And so, if we all have the Spirit of God within us, and we have that God spark, then we, being creators, could potentially create these things by simple thought, without even recognizing it, without even knowing it. And so, how many times we tell these stories, and then all of a sudden we're seeing these creatures come about, and people are seeing them around the world. It's like, why did no one see this prior? Why is it just
Right.
now showing up? So I do find that very intriguing.
Right. Well, and with, you know, a lot of speculation about CERN, them finding the God particle, them possibly creating the different things, or not creating, but creating rifts in reality so that these things can come through too. There's been
Mhm.
that whole speculation too.
The Pandora's box, the modern
Yep.
day Pandora's box.
Right.
Yeah, I missed that game that we played. We used to play it. It was a good game and good times too.
I wonder if you could even play it anymore on Xbox or anything.
Mhm. Um, all right, so we rabbit trailed a little bit here, but going back to leprechauns, why are leprechauns specifically tied to St. Patrick's Day?
Now, here's the thing about that. This is actually a more modern connection to St. Patrick's Day. It began as St. Patrick's Day began as a religious feast day celebrating Ireland's patron saint. But when Irish immigrants came to America in the 1800s, the holiday slowly turned into a celebration of Irish identity and culture and tradition. At that point, Irish folklore symbols like leprechauns, shamrocks, pots of gold started getting folded into the holiday itself. So, in other words, leprechauns represent Irish mythology, not St. Patrick himself. It just got put into this cauldron, just like kind of
And
an example of what US is a cauldron of multiple cultures. And then, like you said earlier, telephone, it kind of gets muddled. And the people that were here, the English people that were here before that, are like, oh, one of my Irish friends said that, yeah, leprechauns used to harass St. Patrick all the time. Not
yeah.
necessarily true. I'm just making that up, but it represents how the game of telephone can really affect mythology and legend.
hmm and in general, leprechauns are also highly associated with, at least in most modern times, with the 3-leaf and 4-leaf clovers, because
Right.
they're also associated with luck in general, which again probably goes back to this idea uh, of them hoarding or protecting gold, pots of gold, if you will, or treasure. Um, and how if they were to lose any part of that treasure, then they potentially lose their luck, and therefore they kind of get sloppy, and they're not as whimsical or quick-witted as they maybe once were prior. Now, of course, that delves into a whole list of things, including uh, multimedia, and we're talking about obviously movies, but also into various books and fairy tales, poems, things like that have kind of branched this idea of the leprechaun and what they actually are, who they are, and what they're capable of. And again, we don't know the exact origin. We don't have a boom, this is the day the leprechaun was created or came about, and this is what their power was, because a lot of these entities that we do talk about on the show, they start pretty small, and then over the years they grow and grow and grow until they kind of become this powerful being in themselves.
Right.
Well, now, were fairies and pagan beliefs actually still around during Patrick's time? Like, we know that pagan beliefs were to an extent. Obviously, that was the whole point of him going there to begin with. But did he have to kind of interact with fairies, or this belief of fairies? And do we know how he interacted with them?
Yeah, and this is where things get interesting. Christianity arrived in Ireland. It didn't erase older beliefs overnight, like we mentioned. It actually didn't erase them at all. It converted them in, or absorbed them into Christianity that's practiced there today. When Christianity arrived in Ireland, it didn't. It was more than just what it was in other parts of Europe.
Mm.
Many people still believed in, fairy folk, sacred hills, spirit realms, nature spirits, uh, all types of different spirits. Instead of eliminating those ideas, Irish culture often blended them with Christianity.
Mm.
That's why Irish spirituality has always had a mystical flavor, like I mentioned earlier, compared to other parts of the world.
Yeah, and we see that with a number of different belief systems. When you look at New Orleans voodoo and its Haitian roots, and how that
Mhm.
is spliced with Christianity, or the modern Christian witch who gets into witchcraft but yet holds on to some of those Christian beliefs and those Christian characters, and those icons that they grew up with, especially within the Catholic Church. So this is something that is widespread and happens from one faith to another, over and over throughout history and throughout the world. So it definitely would make sense that people back then would still believe in the fairy folk and the sacred hills and things like that, and somehow use them to kind of like grow their belief within their new Christian faith and adopt it in.
Mhm.
And I always find it intriguing to see how it's done, because some of it is um, just really fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, like every culture in general, especially ones that were converted from paganism to Christianity, it always is fascinating to see what parts of that culture, the previous culture, I should
Mhm.
say, were kept in the practices of Christianity. And we see that in the US, of course, with Santa Claus and, the Christmas tree and all of that stuff. We
Mhm.
talked about that during our Christmas episode. So yeah, it's interesting, and at the same time, there are those hardcore Christians that will not practice any of that
Mhm.
because it is a pagan connection.
Yeah, 100%. It's interesting to see how one adopts those things and another completely disregards them.
Mhm.
And then again, it comes all down to personal preference, ultimately, your own convictions and belief systems, et cetera, et cetera. So,
Right.
you do have to wonder, or at least I have to wonder, like, as we move, further into modern culture, we see a lot of our old belief systems, a lot of what used to be our current belief systems, transforming. Um, and like I said, the Christian witch, for example, that's pretty new and kind of way out there for old school Christian
Mhm.
church. I mean, in many cases, I would think some of the founders are probably rolling in their graves, like, wait, what's happening? Um, but it makes me kind of wonder, like, 100 years from now, 200 years from now, when there are, if a world even exists by then, um, when you have archaeologists in those times, you know, digging through America or through Europe or, where have you, and they start seeing this combination of belief systems so intricately intertwined, what that kind of thought is right off the bat when they look at it, it's like it's this looks like a hot mess, just like a giant ball of mumbo jumbo, or is it like, oh, this is very intricate and delicate and really fascinating on how these things worked together? Because I think as time goes on, we're going to see more and more splicing of various belief systems and religions.
Mhm.
Um, and of course, I think we will also see much more of just completely disregarding faith altogether, regardless of the system that the
Right.
people are following.
We
But
already
now,
see it now, so yeah, it would
yeah,
continue on.
yeah. So now, really, final question about the leprechauns. When it comes down to it, are leprechauns actually just a myth, or are they particularly something deeper?
this goes with everything we talk about. Researchers are split across the board. Okay, some researchers suggest that fairy folklore might reflect ancient beliefs about otherworldly beings or spirits tied to sacred land. Others believe stories are cultural memory, preserving old pagan traditions. Either way, leprechauns are part of a much larger mythological system that predates St. Patrick by centuries. And that again can be said about a lot of things, and about how we have become afraid of these creatures that may not exist at all. We just saw something, created an image in our mind, and then that became a lot of the like cryptids or even spiritual beings that we know now. And like you mentioned earlier, possibly created them into our reality because so many people started fearing it.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think that's something that we need to consider too. Is like there is this kind of fine line, semi-fine line between fear and adoration or respect, because many of these cultures, they have these entities and these beings that they genuinely respect, right? They Whether or not they look up to them, they at least lived with them, alongside them. When we think about the leprechauns, when we think
Mhm.
about the fae, there are many people who just believe that you live alongside them. Two different types of individual people groups, if you will. Um, but then there are others that do genuinely fear those same things. And a lot of that, of course, comes down to misunderstanding, right? Because, again, especially in modern times, we have a lot of information at our disposal. And a lot of that information isn't good information. It's just thrown together by somebody who wants to create a story or wants to get a lie out there because why not, right? And then we have a lot of individuals who are quickly gullible, and they will find click that first link that pops up in the Google search, read it, take it for fact, shut it down, and boom, they are set in their belief system and in their understanding. But that's why it's important to constantly do research as well, because many of those things that do pop up first isn't typically the full story on Google, right? You got to do a deep dive. You got to, and AI can only do so much. AI too can be tricked. It will often tell you information that is um, most widely accepted or mass produced, rather than getting down to the absolute truth, the ground level, or the foundation of some of these stories. And that goes as far back as like even werewolves, the dogman, vampires. What our very first
Yeah.
episode on UPRN was about the vampire. Uh, and we delved into its origin story, how it began as just a spiritual entity that was just a ghost. Basically, it didn't do anything, it didn't harm anybody, but it grew over the years, over the centuries, and as it grew, it took on new attributes until we got pretty much what we have of vampires today, um, which is in most cases very dark entity that or being that goes out of its way to drink blood, to kill, to harm, to um, live life the way that it knows at the height of the food chain, right? But that's not how it began. And so then you have to question, like, well, if the vampire started as just a ghost, then the vampires that we have today, do they even really exist? Right? Like, how did that happen? Um,
Well, I mean, and it's total fiction, but you bought me a book, a vampire hunting book way back when we were doing Night Stalkers.
mhm,
And it talks about that vampires were the the original vampire was possessed by a demon,
mhm.
or in this case, a spiritual entity. So if there are vampires today, that do suck blood, and I mean we've talked about the energetic or spiritual vampires. Um, Maybe it's a possession case, kind of like a symbiotic relationship.
Right. And that book that you're talking about, if anyone's interested, is actually called Vampire: The Terrifying Lost Journal of Dr. Cornelius Van Helsing. Um, Really fascinating. It's a lot of fun to read, and it's really interesting because it was like the first time I'd heard about or learned about this idea, which is modern now. It's like
Mhm.
very well accepted in um, television and in books. But the idea that vampires, well, the big question is like, how does a vampire use fangs to bite into a victim but yet draw blood at the same time? Because if the fangs are plugging up the holes that the blood comes from, you can't really drink the blood. And so in this book, which way back in the early years of podcasting, this was 2007 or so, 2008. Um, it was the first time I heard about this idea that the fangs have tiny holes that
They were hollow.
basically, yeah, the tooth is hollowed out and draws back into the back of the throat where it can then be ingested or drank. Which again, if you guys have not heard about, or if you guys haven't listened to our episode, I gotta find out what the actual, maybe you know the name of it. We do have an episode about vampires and the reality of them drinking blood. And we go into a very scientific aspect of whether or not a creature like a vampire can actually drink blood and survive hundreds of years, basically. And it's one of my favorite episodes we've ever done. It does use take a scientific approach. We talk about vampire bats, how they drink blood according to their weight, and how that transfers to what a modern vampire would need to survive as well, and whether or not it actually could survive while still remaining hidden all these years.
Are you talking about the one that we first did on, like you just mentioned, on UPRN?
I don't. It might have been. I don't know if it was that one or not. It might have been. Um,
Um, yeah, I'm not sure if that was the one or not. Um, it's gonna take me a while to look for it.
yeah.
But yeah, and there's been quite a few people on TikTok, and I already hear you guys, and it's not that I believe it, but I would love to get them on and have them tell their story. If they are claiming they're vampires, you know, I would love to hear what they have to say. Or, hey, if you're a vampire, email us. I'm not going to say reach out because I don't want you in my house. Email us at paratruthradio@gmail.com. We'd love to bring you on to tell your story. Um,
just
because
just to put out the just for feelers, specifically we're talking about vampires that actually drink blood, not sorcerers.
right, right, and claim to have lived for a very long time, not the human ones that put the fangs in their mouths and drink people's blood at a bloodletting bar. I would love to talk to you too and find why you feel that this is a good way to go about it too.
So when it comes down to St. Patrick, St. Patty's Day in particular, the leprechaun, what are some of your thoughts on the whole origin story here, some of these characters, and just the overall story, the overarching story of these characters and what we celebrate today?
Well, I mean, St. Patrick, without a doubt, is obviously a historical figure.
Mhm.
I mean, we've already talked about it. There's documentation to say that he was a real person. Did he have these spiritual battles with druids? In his mind, it was a spiritual battle, and it, in a sense, was a spiritual battle because he was trying to convert these pagans to Christianity.
Mhm.
Leprechauns. I mean, I've always kind of believed that fairy or fae are real. All spiritual beings, really. Something I kind of looked up as we were discussing stuff is where the green beer and corned beef and cabbage came from,
Mhm.
and I should have known better. But obviously, this is an American um, thing that came about to kind of greet Irish immigrants into celebrating St. Patty's Day the way that we do today. It actually didn't come about till the 19th and 20th century because corned beef was actually a cheaper, accessible substitute for traditional Irish bacon, which apparently is what they would eat in celebration of St. Patrick. And the green beer came about from a man named Thomas H. Curtin, who was a New York club owner in 1914 and added green food dye to beer. And it was, again, just a way to celebrate in the U.S., the Irish American adaptation of St. Patty's Day.
Mhm.
I had never looked that up before. It was just a thing you did, so I never really looked into the history of it all.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's one of those things as far as tradition goes that sometimes gets lost. I'm not talking about the corned beef and cabbage. I'm talking about how we celebrate St. Patrick's Day today. Um, but it's fascinating to look at the history and the folklore and the legends behind it all.
Yeah. No, 100%. I completely agree with you. And I didn't know anything about the green bear and all that. You know, what year was that they did the green dye?
1914.
1914. And I think they still do it the
So,
same way today.
right. And so, in retrospect to history as a whole, that practice is very much in its infancy compared to many other practices that we have today.
Right. Well, as really most anything, not everything, but most everything in America, for whatever reason, it all has to be done bigger and bolder for some reason. So,
I mean,
I don't know. I don't have words for it. It's insane.
yeah.
That's the word we'll go with. It's insane. We all need psychiatry. Yes. But no, I agree with you. And it is a literal fact that Saint Patrick, did exist. He was an actual person who literally did convert Ireland to the Christian faith, and drove out some of the pagan teachings of the druids because of it. And again, whether or not that meant entirely, pushing them out or simply pushing out the belief system that they held is up in the air. But at this point, it doesn't really matter because the simple fact is what he did, it made history, and it took and it stuck, and as in most cases it does or has when it comes to the Christian faith.
Right.
And I do find it all fascinating. And of course, the leprechaun is one of the most fascinating creatures. I call them creatures, but entities that we've come across, and we don't talk about it enough. Obviously, this is something that we always keep for March, really because we have no other reason to bring up the leprechaun outside of March, at least not here in America.
and finding a historian or philosopher or somebody who has written a book about it is kind of rare too.
Oh yeah, 100%. But nonetheless, this is one of our favorite holidays, and we're not party goers anymore. We just like the idea of it. And we here in the US like to dress in green, drink things that are green, eat things that are actually not green in most cases, unless it's a cupcake.
I mean, cabbage is before you cook it.
That's fair. You can use that. Everything green. So, and the funny part is most people that go out partying, they eventually turn green too. So, it's funny how that all comes around. Anyway, this is the end of today's episode. We do hope that you liked it. And if you loved it, please share it with all your friends and family. And also, if you want to talk with us, you have any comments, feel free to reach out. We'd love to hear from you and we will respond. Of course, we love responding. So as we said at the beginning of the show, this has been a live show on 107.7 FM New Orleans, 105.3 FM the Gulf Coast, and the United Public Radio Network. So until next week, where you'll find us same time, same channel, my name is Eric.
And I'm Justin.
Peace.